Hello and welcome to Making Media Now, the Filmmakers Collaborative podcast. I'm your host, Michael Azevedo. Joining me on this episode is Chad Freidrichs, the director and editor of a fascinating and intriguing film called The Cinema Within. The Cinema Within, which is now streaming on Amazon Prime Video and on Vimeo, is a documentary that delves into the psychology of film editing, the mystery of how and why an edited movie feels so natural and so effortlessly makes sense. This visually stunning documentary explores the idea that in film's earliest years, the most common edits were instinctively shaped to fit the contours of human perception, and that this might explain why, more than a century later, most modern-day filmmakers still rely on these exact same techniques. But in the remote mountains of Turkey, a young researcher and a group of people who have never seen a film before put this deepest of cinematic ideas to the test. Drawing on dozens of examples from both well-known and obscure films across cinema history, it explores not only the essential grammar of the world's most popular art form, but the very mechanics of how we perceive reality. Here's the trailer.
What you're looking at is a violent disruption of physical reality. Instantaneously, one picture is replaced by another. So the mysterious fact is that edits work. And it's conceivable, given the nature of the human brain, that a cut from one shot to another could have had a completely disorienting result. And the idea of motion pictures would have died at that point.
But a few years into the 20th century, filmmakers realized that actually, I can cut. And viewers perfectly understand it.
And pretty early on in the game, it became clear many of these edits are totally invisible to people. It's very weird that that would work out.
How do we make sense of films? Are they so natural that even without any experience we can make sense of them?
Şimdi bunu göreceğiz, sonra ne gördüğünüzü söyleyecek.
The first films they've seen in their entire life.
Nereye bakıyor kız?
Ne bileyim ben.
And I thought, very surprising.
Wind the tape back to the beginning, and cinema could have gone a lot of different ways.
And cut!
Why do we have what we have is the question.
Making Media Now is sponsored by Filmmakers Collaborative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting media makers from across the creative spectrum. From providing fiscal sponsorship to presenting an array of informative and educational programs, Filmmakers Collaborative supports creatives at every step in their journey. To learn more, visit filmmakerscollab.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please do like, share, and follow. Now on to my conversation with Chad Freidrichs. Hello, Chad Freidrichs. Welcome to Making Media Now.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're here to talk about your film, The Cinema Within, which is just a riveting and fascinating documentary that if I had to describe succinctly, I would say it's about the perceptions that we carry around with us around our visual engagement with movies. And you've taken a super deep dive in dissecting sort of the origin and the import of those perceptions. But before we get into detail around your film, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your work, and what led you to the making of this movie.
Well, I'm an independent documentary filmmaker. I've been working now for a little over 20 years. My first film was Jandik on Corwood all the way back in 2003. And I've since made, I guess, 5 or 6 features, depending on how you want to count. My most popular film, I guess, is titled The Pruitt-Igoe Myth from 2011 about a housing project in St. Louis. So I actually came to the current project, The Cinema Within, while I was working on Pruitt-Igoe. I happened to be teaching at a film school, basic editing courses as well as film history. And in that process, I taught a lot about the history of editing, and it became clear to me that very quickly that this style, the continuity style that has been used for over 100 years, is something that still used today, and it's been very important in the history of film. And so I began to wonder, why has this style been around for so long? And so that's kind of the impetus for this film was, the films have changed so much since, say, the 1910s, 1920s, when this style was developed. Why is it that certain things about cinema have changed, such as the performance style, obviously the addition of color and sound, and all of these other aspects of cinema, CG today, visual effects. But the basic grammar of film editing, why hasn't that changed? And so that's kind of what got me into this project.
Yeah, let's focus in on that term, continuity editing. So for folks who don't spend large chunks of their lives in an editing suite like you might, tell us what continuity editing is, and what you think in its origins it was attempting to approximate.
Well, so firstly, I think what it was trying to do was to make editing smooth and to be able to tell a story relatively easily. So if you think about a basic edit, it's profoundly unnatural in the sense that, if you just watch a film unfold without any sort of cuts, that's going to look really natural to you. Right. But as soon as it cuts to a different perspective, that's not something that we have in real life. Our eyes don't immediately shift or jump to another perspective. Sure. In reality. And so the kind of the thing that continuity editing was trying to do was to make it so that in an era when you didn't have sound in films, how can we tell a story visually that allows an audience to pretty immediately understand it? Right. So
that's where the continuity comes from. It would be the continuity between image 1 and image 2. So man enters room, there's a cut, oh, man's sitting on a sofa. And the brain is able to say, this guy walked into the room and then sat in the sofa, although I did not see him move from the entryway to the sofa.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a continuity of space and there's a continuity of time. And this continuity is presumed by the audience as they watch the film. Yeah. And there are certain techniques such as the eyeline match, that was developed very early on, that elicit a certain response from the viewer that allows them to understand, oh, I understand that person is looking at that thing, even though we may have never seen those two images together in the same shot.
Sure. Yeah, and in terms of, your film is interesting on so many levels, kind of a history of filmmaking perspective. There's the neuroscience involved. There's some psychology and maybe sociology involved. But one of the things that is really fascinating is that in the early days of cinema, movies were essentially filmed plays. And what was driving that? Was it the fact that this continuity editing just hadn't occurred to anybody? Or was there truly a feeling about, well, how are people going to react if we kind of chop up the action to more fully represent the way we think the human brain might absorb it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think it's a complicated answer, but I think that part of it just has to do with this came out of a tradition of vaudeville. And so the idea was that you would have a proscenium arch that, people would perform in, and they would do like their 5-minute skit, and you would have it just like you would see it in a vaudeville play. And so it's kind of imitating that style initially. But I think there were also concerns among some that, if you did cut into something, that it would feel kind of disruptive, that an audience would be kind of disoriented or confused as to what was going on. And so you have some early, both radical as well as tentative steps towards trying to understand how best to use this. Georges Méliès is a great example, somebody who was basically using kind of match cuts between shots to allow, say, an object to disappear. Right. So in that way, he was kind of creating discontinuity through a style that allowed him to create the impression of continuity.
And in a match cut,
so,
where's the matching part come in?
Match on action is the typical way this is done. And so the idea is that, like, if you're cutting from a wide shot of a baseball player pitching the baseball, and you cut into a close-up of that pitcher, it's going to feel a lot more smooth and natural if you cut in the midst of the action rather than cutting before he's thrown the ball or after he's released the ball. So the action in a way kind of disguises the edit perceptually. And psychologists actually believe that this is some psychologists believe that this is actually driven by an exploitation that the cut is doing to certain motor parts of your brain. That is, parts of your brain that understand motion are exploited by this kind of cut to the point where you actually don't even see it. And that's true. A lot of times you don't even notice these kinds of cuts.
So in the early days of continuity editing taking place and being routinely used, were there any instances wherein audiences recoiled from the experience, or were those initial concerns a bit overblown?
No one threw up. No one, so far as we know, no one threw up. And so far as we know, people generally were able to kind of process these films. They were understood relatively quickly and easily by most people, if done in certain ways. Now, obviously, we have a huge gap in terms of the amounts of films that have survived back then, and the ones that tended to survive likely were the ones that were most popular and that worked with audiences. So I'm sure there was a lot of trial and error. In fact, I've seen plenty of films where, not plenty, but several films where people have tried match on actions. Instead of cutting in the midst of the action, they would show the action twice. So they would show it in the wide shot, and then they'd show the action again in close up. Or they would do what's called an elliptical edit, where you literally cut out the action so that, you have a person kind of hovering over the table with a glass, and then on the close-up, the glass is on the table. Well, neither of those tended to work, and so those got filtered out over time. But the ones that did tend to work stuck around.
So one of the several fascinating aspects of your film is that, sort of to test this theory, you found, or a researcher found, a woman from Turkey, I believe, found this tribe of people in Turkey who had no access, or chose not to have access to, electricity, as I understand it. And so therefore they had no access to television. They had never seen a motion picture. And talk to me a little bit about the theories that this researcher was trying to test.
So the basic idea is that one of the reasons why film editing seems so natural is that it is exploiting certain features of our natural perception. That is how we look around in the world. So to give a very brief example, if I look over to one direction and look intently, what you're likely thinking is, what is he looking at over there? And so you're going to start imagining what it is that I'm looking at, and then you're going to want to turn your head over in that direction and to see what I'm looking at. And so there's a certain kind of cut that does that. It's called an eye line match, and we're all very used to it. And so we can immediately understand it. So the idea that these edits, there's a package of maybe 5 or 6 different edits, depending on how you count, of these continuity edits, that these edits are exploiting the way that we see the world in real life, that we get it instantaneously just because of that's the kind of creatures we are. And so if that is the case, then people who have never seen films for the first time should be able to pretty much understand these edits the first time they see them. Even if the countering idea, of course, is that we learn to understand these edits. Through a process of acculturation and education, we just kind of see enough of these that we kind of figure out how they work without it being explained to us. But if they get them right away, that means that there's something maybe deep down inside these edits and in our perception that kind of gels. Yep. And so that's what she was really trying to test here. This is Sermin Ilderar was the researcher's name, and she did indeed locate folks in Turkey who had never seen films before. And she made these brief clips, you would almost call them. They're not really movies. There's no story to them. Right. There's no dialogue. It's just one shot A and shot B. And she showed them these examples of these basic continuity edits and asked them, what do you see? And you and I would say, well, I see one person looking left to right, and I see a person looking right to left. We wouldn't even describe that way. What we would see is we would see two people looking at each other. Right? That's how we would describe that. And so the question is, do they describe it that way? Are these two people in the same place at the same time, even though we haven't seen them in the same location together?
And the responses were kind of fascinating because, you talk about there was shot A and shot B, and they were very rudimentary. Say in one instance, there was a cow, and the perspective of the cow was kind of head on. And then shot B was the perspective of the cow from the side or something. And there were individuals who said, oh, there's one cow and there's another cow. And yet there were also individuals who said, well, there's a cow and we're looking at them, and this I'm paraphrasing, we're looking at them head on and we're looking at them from the side. What could be attributed to, or how could one attribute those two different perceptions? Are these just two different brains? Is somebody making the cognitive leap that another person isn't?
Well, yeah. So a lot of it has to do with the kind of context of their understanding. So one of the reasons, to go back to film history before we get into Ilderar's work, one of the reasons why the initial viewers may have understood these edits for the first time is because they had a context of understanding these films as an entertainment, as a story. Mm-hmm. So they're going to tend to link those two shots together. Even, they're going to try to look for ways to link those two shots together. Whereas if you don't have that understanding initially, then you may not even try to do something like that. You may view these shots as almost like two photos in a photo album, right? As opposed to shots that require linking to make sense. Yeah. And so that would be probably the best, not to give too much away about the film, but that would be the best way to perhaps interpret how some people understand these shots and some people don't. But, the important thing is that in the film, you see a kind of checkered response. You get some where they do respond very well to how we would describe them. They say that man is looking at that bird, basically. But then other things they don't seem to understand, and it's kind of a mystery as to why they understand things and why they don't as the film unfolds. And so, in a way, what I tried to do with the film was to make it so that the film edits themselves, or at least our response to those film edits, act as kind of the drama of the film. And so the unfolding kind of understanding of how these people understand or don't is, it really drives the dramatic arc.
In speaking to any of the neurologists that you spoke with in making of this film, is there any theory around how the brain might establish and sort of build a visual vocabulary so that at some circuitry within the brain is saying, oh, we've seen this thing before. We know how this works. As opposed to, when I was watching your film, I was remembering some reading I had done around the early advent of just still photography and how certain people reacted quite negatively and fearfully to it. Like, where'd this come from? How did you capture this? And I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but there's, you hear about certain indigenous people who were very reticent to be photographed because they felt their soul was being, stolen from the camera. But when you think about it, it's a new technology that is representing visual evidence of something, and anything new has to be received for the first time in a certain manner. So back to my original question, I was fascinated around how are some brains essentially more ripe territory for this type of visual stimulus.
I'm not. I mean, that's deeper than probably my understanding of the subject is. You have to remember, I'm a filmmaker, not a psychologist, so I wish I knew. I will say that
some great psychologists, and you got some great information from them.
That's true. That's true. I don't think we went into that particular question, but I will say the folks who were shown these films initially didn't seem to have any issue with understanding that, oh, that's a representation of a person. None of them thought that this was like either like a portal that showed, something that was taking place in time. Because they had photos, right? They had photos. And so this was kind of understood as like, this is a kind of moving form of a photo.
The ground level had been set.
Yeah. And they also, in the film, we show them laughing initially when they see this. They enjoyed the process. There's just kind of a pleasure of looking at like kind of moving images. And so just on a kind of fundamental level, and they were aware, they had heard of television. It's just that they hadn't watched much of it, so it's not like this was a completely just completely blow their minds kind of, thing, like if you took it back to like the 18th century or whatever.
Well, and even there didn't seem to be any instance, at least that made it to the film, wherein, it's often, if you talk to a little kid who's watching TV, maybe they're 3 or 4, they're verbal, but you often hear that, oh, those people are in the TV. All of that exists within this screen, or used to be a box. They're not boxes anymore, really. But you didn't necessarily get that from these people in Turkey.
Yeah, because I think they would know that that's impossible, So like there's a certain point where cognitive development is such that you cross over a line where, the idea of fitting people into a small container is just like not likely.
Which again, on an anthropological level, that in itself is sort of fascinating, this kind of, common wisdom, so to speak. When you're thinking about the history of editing, are there particular films that marked significant transitions, no pun intended, around the techniques used with editing and therefore advanced storytelling?
Well, I think there are particular films. Certainly, cross-cutting was mostly perfected by Griffith. That's, I think, historically acknowledged. But a lot of the other
cross-cutting is.
Oh, cross-cutting would be where you're cutting between. So it's sometimes called parallel editing. You're basically cutting from action A to action B, often going on separate occasions. They're not separate occasions.
There's a woman tied to the railroad tracks. There's a woman tied to a railroad tracks. We have a shot of that, and then we have a shot of a railroad coming down the track.
Yeah, exactly. So like the train's coming and the train's in a different spot than her, but we know at some time that those two stories are going to collide, right? And so you see, so a classic example from modern cinema would be like Star Wars, where you have, Darth Vader and Luke battling it out with lightsabers on one track, and then you've got the planet Endor, where the Ewoks are trying to get into the battle station, and then out in space, you've got another track where you've got this space fight. Well, all three of those are presumed by us to be going on at the same time. So that's cross-cutting. And so that was started being developed in the late 1900s and was pretty much perfected by like the mid-19 teens. But a lot of these other kinds of techniques were kind of one-offs or used sporadically throughout films, but weren't necessarily combined into a kind of system. And it was only gradually that these kind of like converged into a system in Hollywood at around the mid-19 teens or so. And so you do have specific films that like the feeding of the sick kitten. I'm not sure if you've seen that, but it's a shot of, a wide shot of two kids feeding a little kitten, and then cut into the close-up of the kitten being fed the medicine. Yeah. And so, but like that wasn't used broadly It was used sporadically, but eventually all of these were kind of linked up in the 19-teens or so. And that's the really important part, was the kind of transforming this into a system, because, that ultimately allowed filmmakers then to have this way of constructing a film and even of shooting the film, so that it will be edited in a certain way. And that's how we do it today. When most of us, at least us mortals who don't shoot it all in one takes, we tend to shoot, when we're shooting a fiction film, we tend to shoot so that it will be edited in this certain way. So it's a whole system that was developed.
And speaking of examples of films being edited, your film is just chock full of dozens of, short clips from very, they're obviously films that are going to underscore your thesis, but it's also just such a rich panoply of films. Tell me about the process of you first deciding, I want to use this film to illustrate that point at that point in time, and then being able to secure rights to use that film.
Yeah, well, so with regards to the rights, it's all fair use. So we are demonstrating how editing works with each of those clips, and so it was felt that is a pretty robust case of fair use. In terms of selection, that's hard, because you could literally take any film that was produced since the 1920s, and just about every single one would have, hundreds of edits, thousands of edits that kind of illustrate the thesis, because it's literally the language that we use to tell movies and fiction films.
You secure the insights of a giant in the editing world, Walter Murch. How did that come about? Did you have a pre-existing relationship with him, or? No.
I just I contacted a collaborator of his who had worked on a prior film, because he's been working on documentaries relatively recently, and so I just contacted him and told him about what we were trying to do and how much I admired his book in the blink of an eye. And how formative that was in my understanding of starting to think kind of naturalistically, I guess you'd say,
yep.
About filmmaking.
Yep.
And so, just contacted him, just sent an email.
And one of the things that I really enjoyed, and you blink of an eye, I'm putting a pin in that word blink, because I couldn't believe how big a role blinking played in our perception of actions in movies. But I want to go back to that. But one of the scenes that Murch actually edited, he was the editor in a classic 70s film called The Conversation with Gene Hackman. I believe Francis Ford Coppola directed that film. And The Conversation, for those who haven't seen it, it's about a guy who's essentially a spy of sorts. He's surveillance professional. He's listening into people's conversations. So there's much of the film where you're just, as a viewer, you're watching Hackman respond to what he's hearing. And so as an actor, that's a huge lift, because you have to be able to be varied enough, in your visual responses, but not sort of over the top by any means. But as an editor, it's particularly challenging, because you have to convey momentum, of the script and of the story. Talk to us a little bit about what Murch's insights within that scene revealed, and how it played into the whole phenomenon of the role of the blink. and you introduce us to someone who is a blink researcher.
So as Murch was, so this was the first feature film that Murch had ever worked on. Edited. He had been a sound designer before that. So he was editing late into the night, working hard, trying to impress the director. And so as he was doing this, he started to notice that the points at which he decided that he wanted to cut away from Gene Hackman, that is, he wanted to cut to something else in the scene, he would just kind of watch, and he would discover that slowly he discovered that those points generally tended to be points at which Hackman blinked. Yeah. So there was some sort of alignment between Murch wanting to cut away to a different shot and Gene Hackman blinking, and so that was a kind of big mystery to him. And then, as Murch tells the story, he happened to read at that time an interview with John Huston, in which Huston talked about the blink being very similar to a film edit. And so that sets him down on this path that he recounts in his book, In the Blink of an Eye. And we actually have, in the film, we actually have the original archival audio that Murch utilized to write that book. The book is based upon a lecture that he gave in Australia in the 1980s. And so we have a recording of that. So he's giving that lecture in the film.
And I have to ask a question about that. So you do, it's a really innovative way that you sort of reenact that lecture, because we hear the audio of the lecture and then we cut to an actor portraying Murch at that time in his life. Is that actor just a really good Walter Murch impersonator, or was that dubbed?
No, that's the original audio. So we specify that in the film that's the original audio. And so, yeah, he's just a really good lip syncer and a really good actor in general.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, I mean, there are tricks you can do. Every now and then he would drift out of sync a little bit. And so there's tricks we can do to kind of speed him up to make him match the original audio. And so, but yeah, he was just spot on. The people who were sitting in the audience were kind of mesmerized as he was, talking, because you'd hear the audio coming from the speaker.
With figuring out which was which. Was it what was going on?
It's tough because you don't want the audience to kind of focus too much on the technique there about his performance, that you want them to pay attention to what he's saying. But there is this kind of like Marvel quality, just like watching him, perform and being in sync with the
and
the
there's
audio.
also there's this great physical resemblance too. So you got a guy that could pass for Walter Murch at that time in his life. So going back to blinks for a second, there's a word introduced that I had never even heard, saccades. So there's a relationship between blinking and saccades. Break that down for us.
Yeah, so these are the two major visual disruptions that we experience in our lives. And they're happening all the time without you realizing it. I think we blink somewhere between every 4 and 5 seconds on average, which is about 5 times more than necessary to lubricate what we need to lubricate our eyes. We're blinking far more than we actually need to.
If you ask somebody, why do we blink? The assumption is, well, we need it to, as you say, lubricate our eyes, keep the windshields sort of clean, but that's not really necessary.
Yeah, in fact, what psychologists have found is that the more social an animal is, the more they tend to blink. Relative to that. So if you look at a lizard, to the extent that a lizard blinks, it's only blinking just for that kind of lubrication or whatever it needs to homeostatically. But the more, an ape will blink almost as much as a human will, and a dog will kind of be in between. So there's something there that has to do with the sociability of the animal that has to do with blinking. And so they already knew that. But then this other term, saccade, we're saccading all the time. So like literally 3 or 4 times per second, we move our eyes around. And so what a saccade is basically, it's either it can be a very small eye movement, or it can be a very broad eye movement where you shift your eyes all the way across your visual field. But you're constantly doing that. Just watch somebody when they're talking. Their eyes are constantly moving. They're just moving in and out. Yeah. And so each time that you have, if you think about it, like one of the reasons why I call them a visual disruption, if you think about it, when you blink, your eyes are closed, so you're not seeing anything. It's black. And yet we don't experience it that way, right? When you actually blink, you're not really seeing black at all. You don't even notice the blink, right? The only time you actually notice a blink is when you're on something like Zoom, where you have a delay between your image and what you're actually doing. And so you actually do see yourself blink. Well, the same things happen with saccades. You can watch yourself saccade on screen as your eyes like move around like crazy. Well, if you think about it, what's actually going on there with a saccade is you have this blur that takes place whenever your eye's moving that rapidly, right? So, but we don't see that blur. What happens to that blur? That blur gets cut out, right? Same with the darkness that happens with the blink, and our brain fills that in with what it thinks belongs there. And so there's all sorts of, so like one really cool kind of thing is called the chronostasis effect. So this idea is that if you just shift your eyes to a clock right at noon, the first second will feel slightly longer to you than all subsequent seconds.
Okay.
The reason why that is because as you're shifting your eye, what happens is whenever we have that blur from our eye shifting from one thing to the next, what gets filled in during that blur is what you arrive at. So if I shift my eyes over to the 12 right at high noon on the clock, the brain is going to backfill that image in to the moments where my eyes are shifting. That's why it feels slightly longer perceptually whenever we arrive at that 12. And so our brain is constantly doing that. If you think our eyes are moving 3 times a second. So you're constantly stitching together these little snippets of eye movements as you move around the world, and you're stitching it together into something that feels continuous, that feels like a whole thing, much like a film feels like a whole thing. And so that's the idea behind what's called this cognitive film theory. This particular idea is that film resembles our reality in such a way, close enough, that our mind tends to construct it and perceive it in the same kind of way that it perceives our reality.
And so in the vocabulary of film editing, and just to kind of break it down, a saccade would be analogous to, say, a pan left or a pan right or a look around the room, whereas the blink is the cut from object A to object B?
Well, a saccade would be, if you're looking to make an analogy, the saccade would be like a cut just to a different perspective, because what happens is that the blurry part as the eye moves gets cut out. And so what you actually see is just person A and then cut to person B. Okay. In the same way as you move your head across a scene. So John Huston uses this in his example that Walter Murch cites in the film. Take a look at me, and then look at a lamp over in that room. What you tend to notice is that when you move your head from one object to another, you tend to blink as you move your head. Yeah. And so watch people when they do this. Like, actually ask them to do that. Look at me, look at that lamp over there, and then look back at me. They'll blink on both instances as they move their head. In addition,
do we know whether that's the brain sort of, clearing the palette and saying, okay, new info incoming, make room for it?
I think the idea is that, and my suspicion, I'm not sure how much this has been verified, but basically I think our brain knows, because we're making a shift there, that the thing in between isn't going to be of interest. And so we might as well go ahead and get it a blink at that moment. You know what I mean? So we want to get to B from A. And so like the stuff in between doesn't really matter. So might as well go ahead and blink there, because we know we're going to really focus and look really deeply at the thing that we arrive at when we arrive at B. Yeah. And so I think that's the thinking.
It brought up for me sort of this chicken or egg question, in the sense that was early filmmaking a byproduct of like sort of innate brain chemistry and relationship between the eyes and the brain, or was it the other way around? Did the visual world in which people were living retrain the brain to be able to process visual information in a particular way?
Yeah, it's a profound question. I mean, it gets to, the nature of us and the way that we perceive the world. And, it also gets to the question of like whether film could have been any different. Could we have a kind of secondary alternative cinema that would be the dominant form? Of course, we have many different kinds of cinemas. Experimental film is all over the place. But in terms of the kind of one that most of us kind of watch for most of our lives, could there have been? Could we have been trained to have another one? And, those are really deep questions that I think Ilrar's research kind of, starts to pick away at and starts to get to some answers, because and you'll have to see the film. I don't want to give it all away, but like there are certain aspects of these things that do appear to be kind of immediately understood. And there are other things that require kind of contextual understanding. And so, I mean, in a way, and so often in the case of these nature kind of nurture questions, the answer is both,
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you're making this film, you're learning this information. Did you become more conscious of how all of these factors impact how you do your job as an editor, and also just how you experience viewing film?
I think I became more aware of my perceptions than anything else. So how I perceive in real life, I became more aware of my blinking. I became more aware of my saccades. Just like constantly aware of those. And, I've had the experience of talking to people after the film, and they're just like kind of constantly noting how much they blink for a little while, In terms of like my actual practice, I don't know. I don't know if it really changed my outlook on the way that I was familiar with Murch's work already, and certainly a lot of the other kinds of things that we address in the film I was familiar with before. So in truth, I don't know if it really shaped or changed, at least that I'm aware.
Yeah. So are you ever
practice.
watching a film and you're thinking as a viewer to yourself that, well, that cut wasn't necessary, or geez, a cut would really help out, in this scene?
Yeah. Yes, sometimes. I mean, I tend to be a pretty forgiving viewer, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not going into films to try to critique them usually. And so, but usually it's on the broader scale, like, could I cut 20 minutes out of this, as opposed to like, boy, that was a bad cut. Because usually, if the film reaches me, chances are it's gone through like several layers of really professional people polishing it. And so you're not going to really have too many choices that will be too wild. But when people do make those choices, I think that's always very interesting as well. And so more often than not, it's more of just like, wow, that was an interesting choice. You know?
Yeah, well, it's such a fascinating film. If you're a film lover, if you're into film history, if you're into sort of the way the brain interacts with the visual stimuli all around it. So it checks all of these boxes. I can't recommend it highly enough. You can find it on Vimeo, and you can also find it on Amazon Prime now. And I've been speaking with the director and perhaps even more importantly, the editor, Chad Freidrichs. Thank you for your time, sir. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.